Imagine your favourite team is off to a great start in the new season, but then they hit a catastrophic loss. Not just a 30-point margin, but a 70-point one. Today, we're looking at the worst NRL losses on record, so let's get right into it. Number 10. The Brisbane Broncos versus the Sydney Roosters. This 59-0 loss for the Broncos is pretty bad, but way better than the others on the list. This game had the Broncos left in the dust with a split second place from the Roosters. Luckily for Broncos fans, they managed to score a few other wins after this game, but the rest of the season hit them with loss after loss. Number 9. The Canterbury Bulldogs versus the Newcastle Knights. This painful defeat for the Bulldogs was dug in even harder than the 66-0 score by a similar game playing out in 2021, just 2 years ago. Manly dominated the Bulldogs in 2021 on the 3rd of June. The Newcastle Knights did the same with the exact same score on the 2nd of June, just 2 years later. Their plays just weren't good enough to keep up with the opposition, but maybe the rugby gods just hated the Bulldogs. Sorry fans. Number 8. The Penrith Panthers versus the Canberra Raiders. This game was a slap in the face by the Raiders with a 62-point margin. This is a little less than the last one, but the score is just as insane. The scoreboard read 74-12, which gets its place because of the sheer scoring with the Raiders, with Terry Campese scoring over 36 points by himself. At least the Panthers stood a chance, which is not the case for number 1. Number 7. The New Zealand Warriors versus the Melbourne Storm. This loss set a record for them with the Anzac Day clash, where they were absolutely dominated, 7-10, but it didn't start that way. The match started relatively normal, with the Warriors only letting a few points slip, but an NRL record was broken as the Melbourne Storm scored 54 points in the second half alone, and the Warriors slipped up and let the opposition overtake them. Number 6. The Sydney Roosters versus the Canberra Raiders. This game was played over 30 years ago and it still makes it onto the list. This game was about as lopsided as every other entry here, with a score of 74-12. This game shows a failure for the relatively respectable Roosters. A lot of things can happen in 33 years. The club's development isn't a big stretch, but this loss for the Roosters let the Raiders get their first minor premiership, so this also helped about as much as it destroyed. Number 5. The St. George Illawarra Dragons versus the Melbourne Storm. This 2000 game was at least a little more fair, with the Dragons scoring 10 points, but then again they did let 70 slip, just like the Warriors. This was a grand final rematch, and it probably didn't go down as the victory they were hoping for, but at least everyone must have learnt from their very large mistakes, right? Number 4. The Newcastle Knights versus the Brisbane Broncos. This match ended in a 71-6 win for the Broncos, which shot the Knights right down to the bottom and made the Broncos their biggest win. The Knights ended at the bottom of the ladder with just one other win of the season, so this win might have just been handed to the Broncos. Luckily, the Knights have turned themselves around enough and gotten a little less horrible, but that is just as debatable for number 1. Number 3. The Parramatta Eels versus the Canberra Raiders. Even though this is another Raiders win, the match get its spot from the destruction that was rampaged on the poor Eels, with another 68-0 against them. This set a standard for 1993 with that insane playing from Canberra here. Eels fans who attended the game definitely didn't have the usual celebratory night, with the players basically just giving up. Number 2. The South Sydney Rabbitohs versus the New Zealand Warriors. This 0-66 loss for South Sydney was not only devastating for the team, but also historically important. The season had been going horrendous for them, and after finishing the season with only 3 wins, the public hated them. The coach at the time was so disappointed he decided to offer a public apology. Luckily, the Rabbitohs have greatly improved since then, but the Warriors were just too strong for them at the time. And finally, drumroll please, number 1, the North Queensland Cowboys versus the West Tigers. This catastrophic loss for the Tigers was relatively recent, happening just a few weeks ago on July 1st. The game ended in a 74-0 win for the Cowboys. and this would have made quite the disappointment for the West's Tiger coach. This match set a record for the NRL for the biggest winning margin. You can tell that the Cowboys' passing and teamwork was on point, but was it above average, or were the Tigers just doing horrible? The Wests seem to be having bad luck this season, ending up at the very bottom with 3 wins and 15 losses, in comparison with the Cowboys, who were sitting around the middle with 11 wins and 8 losses. Overall, their total record stands relatively close, which could factor into the equation. And that's it. If you guys liked the video, then subscribe to see more like this, and comment what you thought of the rankings and if you would put them any differently. And we hope to see you in the next video.